If you want to rise above life's inevitable obstacles and move onward, this show is for you. We all need encouragement in dealing with adversity. Each week, my guests and I engage in authentic conversations about moving onward when confronted with challenges. We are vulnerable and honest as we share insights from our journey, as well as practical tips, inspiration, and resources you can apply to your specific situation, enabling you to move onward. I'm Emily Harmon. Thank you for joining me today. Hello, welcome to another episode of Onward. In this episode, I interview Steve Iselin. Steve and I worked together in the Navy. He recently retired as a senior executive where he served as the principal deputy for the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy, Installations, and Environment. In that role, he led a 40-person staff setting policy and guiding $12 billion a year of energy, installations, environment, and safety programs at Navy and Marine Corps installations. He also served our country as a naval officer for 20 years. Steve shares how he went from, in his words, the top of the world to wanting to jump off it. Steve did not know a lot about depression, and neither did his wife, but they learned quickly, and Steve credits his wife with saving his life. Steve shares how he turned his pain into purpose, how he moved onward from a serious clinical depression to founding the National Capital Area chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I'm thankful that Steve speaks publicly about his depression because I know he's helping others, and I'm sure this episode will help somebody listening today. Someone who is feeling depressed themselves, or who perhaps knows a loved one or a coworker dealing with depression. As Steve shares in his interview, there are ways to get through depression and move onward. And Steve shares with us how he did it. Good morning, Steve. Thanks for being here today.
Hey, happy to be here.
How's retirement going?
Retirement's fantastic.
Okay, so, we've talked about what this podcast is about, inspirational stories, helping people overcome challenges in their lives. And everybody has a challenge in their life. Everyone has obstacles. You being a former senior executive, me being a former senior executive by the time this podcast comes out. You and I have both been vocal about some of the challenges that we've faced in our lives. And I think it's my opinion that I would like to get more people to be vocal about that, because I think a lot of people are struggling, but sometimes don't speak up about it. I can just picture myself in meetings at work, and my mind goes to, everyone's acting like everything's perfect, everyone's fine, but people are struggling and we don't really talk about it. And I think it's okay to talk about it. And that's why I'm happy that you're here as a guest today, because you struggled through a challenge that you're probably still are working through, but you've overcome it and you moved onward. And so I wanted to talk with you about that today. And could you tell us a little bit about your story?
Sure. And thanks for doing this, Emily. This is really helpful I hope it's helpful for people. And I often say when I talk about my journey falling into a very deep depression and coming out of it, is that when I talk about it, if I help just one person, we've done a good thing. And my hope is we'll help many more than one. So my story starts back in 2000. I'm a dad, a husband. We have 4 children at the time. This was April of 2000. And I was finishing a 20-year active duty Navy career working at the Pentagon. And I was doing very, very well. I was selected to brief the Chief of Naval Operations on a whole range of issues at that time. Out of 12 other guys, I wouldn't have been selected if I wasn't doing a good job. And then in a matter of weeks, I was thinking about taking my own life and fell into the deepest depression. And what it turned out to be was the stress that came on from this career transition, thinking about I would have to find a job, I would have to do something different. How was I going to support my family? And that stress put me into a very, very deep depression that I didn't think I could get out of. And as I said, in a matter of 3 or 4 weeks, I went from briefing the Chief of Naval Operations to wanting to take my own life. And I'll tell you a little bit more. I started a new job. I had 10 job offers, so that's kind of some indication that I had something going on. But in the first week on my first job, I couldn't function. I was literally unable to make decisions about what to wear in the morning or what to eat for breakfast, let alone lead a group at a work environment. And so after the 4th day, I made a decision to quit my job. And on the morning of the 5th day, I woke up determined to go kill myself. I took my son's old 1989 Honda, the one without the airbags. And I drove around the Washington, D.C. Beltway looking for an abutment to crash into. And I don't know why. I think it was just thinking about my family that prevented me from actually executing my plan. But I was gone for the whole day. I drove over 300 miles. And when I got home, I was greeted by a real distraught family who wondered what the heck was going on. I'm alive today because of my wife. She took me down in the basement, read me the riot act, and said, "Hey, you can't do this. We have to get you help." And she did get me help. She got me to a psychiatrist. And this is a question he asked me, and I share this with your audience because I think it's a good one. Oftentimes we see each other on the street or in the office and we say, "Hey, how you doing?" And the pat answer is, "I'm fine, I'm good." But the psychiatrist said, "What's your number?" And 10 being I'm on top of the world, and 1 being I want to jump off it. And I lied to him, told him I was a 3, even though I desperately wanted to jump off the world. I felt like I was a burden to my family. I would never be able to provide, and that's the reason why I wanted to take my life. And he was smart enough to realize I was lying and prescribed me some antidepressants, and encouraged, more than that, kind of directed my wife to get me some counseling as well. So over about 4-month time frame, I went to 16 counseling sessions. And the greatest lesson I got out of that is I couldn't be perfect. And that's something that's kind of in the core of my being, is I try to be perfect at everything I do. And when you're in the middle of a depression, the last thing you can be is perfect. You can barely get out of bed. And so appreciating that every day and everything, you can't do everything well, that you're going to make mistakes, you're going to struggle. And that's part of the human existence, was really a helpful lesson for me. During the course of the summer, I went to a second job, still was struggling with concentration, couldn't complete that job, and finally fell into a third job. And during that third job, my wife had told my new employer that I was in the middle of a depression. He was very patient with me and understood that it was going to take a little bit of time for me to recover. And one day I went to work and I experienced a few moments of peace. The next day, maybe 20 minutes of peace. When I say peace, that means not thinking about ending my life. And then finally one day I woke up and went almost the whole day. And that was really the medication helping solve the chemical imbalance in my brain, combined with better sleep. You know, when you're in the middle of a depression, you struggle with sleeping, you struggle with eating, everything gets thrown off. But the good news is slowly I emerged from that depression. And by August or September timeframe, I was back to being a real functioning adult. So that's kind of the story of my depression, my struggle. And what I'll say is, flashing forward to 2019, I'm not recovered from depression. I still live with depression. I take medication once in the morning and once at night. I still remember the counseling tools that I learned to cope with struggles. And even this call is, striking some raw nerves and conjuring up some memories of a really, really dreadful time in my life. But I speak about it because I think it's important to know that people who are struck with mental illness can push through. There is hope. There is treatment. There are ways to get through this. And I often say, too, that in a lot of ways, I'm better today than I was before I had that depression. I'm much more compassionate, much more caring, much more mindful of my well-being and the well-being of others. And I just think there was a reason why I struggled through it. And we'll talk more about that as we go through this call.
Wow. What a story, Steve. Did you want to get help initially, or did your wife have to really force you to go get help?
Yeah, here's what I'd say. That's a great question, and it brings up my point of view, because I think it's important for the listeners to know what's the point of view of somebody who's thinking of taking their own life. There's a perspective, and one that I shared before I went through this is, oh, they're just crazy. Let them kill themselves. But what I'd say is I didn't want to die, but I just didn't want to live. The living was agony. And I liken it to the people who were at the top of the tower on 9/11 when the plane went in. And there was fire below, and some of those people jumped off the building. And I'm 100% sure they didn't want to die, but their living at that moment was agony. It was physical agony from the fire. And what I'd say is when you're in the depths of a really bad depression, it's mental anguish, it's mental agony that's incessant. And I just wanted that to stop. And so that was my mindset. I wanted to stop the pain. It's not that I wanted to die.
And I want to make it clear that, you're not a doctor, you're not a mental health care professional. We're just talking about the situation that you went through, and people can use it to help themselves to figure out how to maybe handle their own depression or the depression of a loved one. But definitely people should seek professional help when they're going through depression.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if any of your listeners are tuning in now that they themselves or someone they know is in a crisis, there's national hotlines that can be called to get some immediate support. 1-800-273-TALK is the national crisis line for people who are in crisis for mental health.
We'll put that in the show notes as well. So I'm just wondering, you talked about how it started off with maybe not having trouble making decisions on what to wear in the morning. You couldn't really think clearly. Did the thoughts of killing yourself start slowly, or did just one day it hit and you got in the car and left?
I think it started slowly, but it went quickly. Probably within a matter of a week, I was thinking about ending my life. It's just a feeling of inadequacy, of being a burden. And in hindsight, now that I've gotten through this and I've done some volunteer work in the suicide prevention realm, there's a school of thought that says a couple of things happen. Either you feel you're a burden or you feel you don't belong. So there's this isolation. Some people get isolated, feel like nobody will miss me if I'm gone. And then there's the burden aspect. And I was clearly the burden, the one who felt like I was a burden to others. Thankfully, I had that connection with family that kept me, that belonging with family probably was my lifeline that kept me alive.
So how did your children handle the illness? How did you explain it to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. My oldest was 15 at the time. My youngest was about 7, maybe 8. And so the younger kids, they knew something wasn't right, but couldn't quite figure it out. And we didn't take time at the moment to explain it to them. My older two, 15 and 13, my wife did all of that. She explained Dad was sick. He needed help. We were going to try to get him help. I'll answer it in another way. About 5 years later, my oldest son, who was at college, we had a conversation. He was 20 at the time. In my mind, he was on top of the world. He was a student at Notre Dame, getting very good grades, living the great college life. And one day we were talking, he said, Dad, I don't know if I can ever be happy. And I said, why not? And he said, well, I saw you when you went through your depression. I thought you were like top dog and everything. You had the world by the tail. And you nearly wanted to kill yourself. He said, if that happened to you, what about me? What hope do I have? And that just gives you some insight into the perspective of how a 15-year-old views his dad dealing with this really serious mental illness. And the point to be made there is that just like cancer, what if your dad had cancer? That's a traumatic experience. What if your mom had a heart attack? It's like when an adult or a key figure in your life goes through a trauma like this, it has ripple effects throughout the family, throughout all of the connections that a person has in their lives. And it's something to take stock of, is to say, hey, how do we treat the rest of the folks who are impacted by this illness? In hindsight as well, now that shortly after I recovered, and we certainly, part of the recovery was learning all we could about depression and why does it happen and how is it treated. We looked at our kids and we said, oh my gosh, Maureen has been living with depression. Our then high school 9th grader, she would come home from school, lock herself in her room, and just was totally unhappy. And we encouraged her, and she agreed to go get some treatment. And as it turns out, all 4 of our children over the course of the last 15 years have gotten some help for mental health. And as a result, each of their lives is infinitely better. So they're taking care of their mental wellness in a way that they probably wouldn't have if we didn't learn the lessons from my experience.
That's a good point. I mean, we teach kids growing up, you got to go to the doctor, get your checkup every year, brush your teeth. We don't necessarily talk, at least I hadn't, very much about what do we do about making sure that our mental health is good.
Yeah, I go back to what's your number? That was common in our society, is to say, hey, Emily, what's your number today? And some people are never going to get to a 10. Some people's high point might be a 7 or an 8. But the thing to pay attention to is, when do you deviate from your norm? When do you start to slide down to a level where you need to get some remedial help?
So, but the behavior that your daughter was showing, going to your room, being alone, that's what a normal teenager does. So how do you determine if it's depression or something that's normal?
Well, we just asked. We asked her, how do you And that's to the point about the stigma around discussions of mental health is we just don't want to talk about it. Even the topic of this podcast, I suspect if you have some regular listeners, there may be a few who decide, I don't want to listen to this one because this looks like a dark topic. I don't think I want to hear about depression. That's not who we are. It's not something I want to participate in. But I'd say is they're doing themselves and they're doing their families and they're doing everybody they come in contact with a disservice, because one message I'd like to share is that we can all be caregivers. If you know the signs of mental illness, irritability, changing sleep patterns, changing appetites, withdrawing from things you normally like to do, being isolated, giving away possessions, things like that, if we know and just are aware of when are people behaving differently from their norm, and then reach out and say, hey, I notice you've been behaving a little differently. I saw this. Are you okay? Do you need help? And if we would have more of those conversations, I can tell you that had my wife noticed subtle changes in me before I got into crisis, it would have been a lot easier to treat my depression. I started taking those antidepressants before I fell to rock bottom. And that's what I hope our country could get to, is earlier intervention so that we don't have so many people reach crisis stage.
Yeah, because like you said, we just tend to say, how are you doing today? Fine. And we accept that. Or I'm busy. Those are like kind of acceptable answers.
Yeah.
I won't go into it in this podcast. I know I'll talk about it in another one. I won't go into it in detail here, but I've been depressed too. I remember when I was dealing with a lot of issues with my son or in a bad marriage. I remember days when I just couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't get out of bed. And I think if most people are honest, probably most people have thought as they're driving down the road, what would happen if I just swerved a little bit and hit that truck? You took it a little more seriously. You drove 300 miles thinking about it.
Yeah.
I think quite a few people have probably been there. What was it about your employer that was patient with you about it? Why do you think that employer was so understanding?
I think my wife had the conversation with him that said, hey, Steve's got depression. Here's what depression is. Antidepressants typically take 4 to 6 weeks, depending on which one you're taking, to really have an effect. He's in his 4th week. We expect soon it's going to start to help him. He's a good guy. Please hang in there with him. And I think that helped.
If your wife hadn't done that, would you have?
No way. No.
You wouldn't have said it. Would you advise people now to be honest about that? Not that you would be dishonest, but to be forthright about that?
I wished everybody could be. I'm not so sure that every employer would be as compassionate as mine was.
You have a security clearance, right? Or you did when you were in so after your depression, you ended up moving out of being a government contractor. You moved into being a civil servant. You moved up to be in the senior executive service, which is some of the highest ranking civilians in federal service. How can you do that with depression? Why didn't that impact your security clearance? I think a lot of people are concerned about speaking up because of that.
Sure. I think the mindset about security clearances and mental illness has changed. It's no longer something that excludes you from holding a clearance. I will tell you, though, that they ask some questions, and the questions they'd ask is, okay, tell us a little bit more. What are you doing to ensure your mental health is good? Oh, I see a psychiatrist every 6 months. I take this medication twice a day. I've been to this counseling. Here's the things I've done to ensure that I remain stable. And, those are fair questions to be asked and answered. And once they were asked and I answered them, I got my clearance. So I don't think people should shy away, but realize that there is going to be, they're going to drag you through one more knothole to get that clearance.
Okay. Well, can you talk about your nephew, Danny?
Yeah. So in 2000, I survived my depression and was being treated and moving along smartly. Flash forward to 2005, July 22nd, 2005, about 4 p.m, I was on the 16th hole at Army Navy Country Club playing golf. I'll never forget it. And I got a phone call from my brother, and he said, hey, Steve, Danny's struggling. We think he's got depression. Could you give him a call when you get home? This was a Friday. So that night I called Danny and I spoke to him for about 45 minutes, and he was exhibiting signs of depression, but we spoke for a long time. And even though I had been suicidal, even though I had that lived experience, And even though I asked him this question, I said, Danny, you're not thinking about hurting yourself, are you? And he said, no, Uncle Steve, I'm fine. I love you. And that's how we ended the conversation. The next morning, we got the call that Danny had taken his own life. And that was devastating news for me and for our family. So he, like I, went from being on the top of the world. He had been married 6 months earlier. He had a great job, went into a deep depression. And unfortunately for him, he didn't win that battle. He was 27. And 1 year after his death, my brother, his wife, myself, and my wife, we went to San Francisco for what's called an Out of the Darkness walk. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention conducts these walks, 1 or 2 per year. And they're really intended to be an opportunity to shed light on mental illness and suicide prevention. And when we showed up at the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge, we saw about 2,000 people assembled there to do this walk through the night. And I will tell you, that's the first moment that my brother stopped blaming himself. Up until that point, Dad loses his son to suicide. It's like, what did I do to cause this? He had this huge amount of guilt. And when he saw that many people assembled, and all of them had been affected by suicide, he said, gee, maybe this is a bigger thing than I realized. And that helped him cope with the fact that his son lost the battle with the mental illness, unfortunately by suicide. But as a result of Danny's death, it had a huge effect on our whole family. A couple of years later, I volunteered to help with a local community walk by AFSP. And then in July of 2010, with the help of 12 other passionate volunteers, we formed the Washington, D.C. chapter of AFSP. There hadn't been one. That kind of gives you a sense of the state of mental health support in our country. AFSP's headquarters is in New York City, but they operate with local chapters. And in 2010, there was no chapter in our nation's capital.
To spell out what AFSP is.
Yeah, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They're a nonprofit.
No chapter in D.C.
There was no chapter in D.C. So we fixed that problem, and that was some really good work. And why did I do that? Why did I pour so much time into that? I did it to honor Danny, to see if we couldn't help some others. Although I couldn't help Danny, we could certainly help a lot of others by getting this organization started. How did Danny's suicide impact your depression? Because you had been, pretty healthy from 2000 until 2005 when that happened. Right. Yeah, no, it didn't really impact me. I was continuing to it probably steeled my resolve to continue caring for myself, what I'd say. It's probably the biggest thing that it did. I'll tell you, over the course of the now 19 years I've been taking medication, I've tried to go off the meds twice. And both times when I went off the medications, I didn't feel as good as I do with them. And so I've convinced myself this is just part of who I am. I'm going to take 2 pills a day till I die. And just like somebody who has diabetes or high blood pressure or some other condition. So, right. I think that's a thing that happens quite often, where you start to feel good and you think that maybe you don't need the medicine. Right. And you go off it, but then you realize maybe part of what's really contributing to you feeling good is the medicine, and it's helping it. But it can't be just medicine, right? What are some of the things that your counselors taught you about how to deal with depression? Yeah, the biggest thing I mentioned was about perfection, but I also exercise regularly. I do breathing exercises. Even in those bad meetings we sat in together in the Pentagon, you might have noticed sometimes I would close my eyes and just take really deep breaths and cleansing breaths to just relax myself. I try to make sure I sleep well. I've done yoga, and I continue to do some version of my own personal version of yoga after I exercise to stretch and let some of that stress out. I take vacations, very religious about, don't let 3 months go by without getting away and giving myself some time. I treat myself to the little treats here and there, and I just try to be kind to both myself and to others. So even when you were in your very, very busy and hectic Pentagon job, you took vacation. I took vacation. A lot of senior executives retire with huge balances of leave, and I didn't. I felt like that leave was something I needed, and it was the investment in my well-being that I had to have. I think that's important, and maybe that's something that leaders can do more often, is set that example.
Because I think if the leadership takes leave, takes vacation, takes time off, and isn't on their phone all the time or checking their email while they're on vacation, it sends a signal to the employees that they can do the same thing.
Yeah, and I'll use that comment to tell another story. So you asked me about Danny's suicide. How did it affect me? And you referenced the fact that I've been a boss in an organization. After Danny died, I got up the nerve. I became brave enough to start to talk about not only my mental illness, but Danny's suicide. And I did it in public forums, including in the workplace. And I've done that, I did that from about 2006 until I retired. Every time I went to a new job or had a new group of people I was leading, I would stop at the beginning and spend 15 or 20 minutes telling my personal story about dealing with mental illness, suicide, and suicide prevention. And why did I do it? I did it because I felt it was important. 1 in 10 high school kids will have thoughts of suicide during the course of a school year. 20 million Americans every year live with depression. And that doesn't talk about bipolar or schizophrenia and some of the other mental illnesses that are out there. So mental illness is a prevalent problem in our society. 1 in 5 people will lose a family member to suicide, and 3 in 5 will know somebody who's died by suicide. And so I felt it was important to talk about my story and to share and let people know, hey, the boss lives with depression. The boss got help. If he got help, maybe I can go get help. And I can tell you, in every organization that I shared that story, within months after sharing it, I'd have somebody approach me on the side and say, thanks so much for telling me that. My daughter lives with depression. Or, I've been thinking about going to get help. After you had the bravery to speak up, I went and got help, and I'm now on an antidepressant. And so you never know who you're going to affect or how you're going to touch somebody. But I can tell you, I've also never had anybody come up and say, I wish you hadn't said that.
Right.
So I think it's an important part of our society. We, in today's day and age, which is more complex than ever, we need to help each other.
I completely agree. I've been preparing for this podcast and thinking about why I wanted to start this podcast. And when I was in the Navy, I would have phone conversations with all of the small business professionals across the country. And this past December, I ended my conversation. I hadn't really planned it, hadn't really thought about it, but they were all on the line. And I said something like, make sure you take care of yourself over the holidays, take care of your family members, because this is a time when, people can feel depressed. If you look on Facebook or any of the social media accounts, everyone is talking about the highlight reels of their life. Everything seems positive and no one's having any problems and family get-togethers are perfect. And life's really not that way. And it's okay if you're feeling sad, to talk to somebody. And I got so much feedback on that phone conversation and those comments that I made. It wasn't the work stuff that I talked about. It was that people appreciated it.
Yeah.
So what things would you want everyone to know about mental illness? You might have covered some of it, but as we wrap up, are there some specific things that you want people to walk away from this conversation with knowing?
Yeah, this will be a bit of stream of consciousness. I'm going to challenge your editor here. I like to talk about mental wellness as opposed to mental illness. So number one is everybody should think about, how's my mental wellness? How am I doing? Am I a 10? Am I as good as I can be today? And realize that some days you won't be. But when it becomes persistent, 2 or 3 weeks in a row, you're at a number below your norm, that should be a signal. So not just yourself then, what about others around you? You can be a caregiver is another point, is to say, hey, if you really care about those family members, then pay attention to their mental wellness. If you really care about those employees, pay attention and have a conversation to say, hey, how you doing? What's your number? I would say another point is a mental illness doesn't discriminate. I had a pretty good life going. I was a successful Navy officer and, as I mentioned, 10 job offers, and I thought I was on top of the world and never dreamed that I could fall into that deep darkness of depression, but I did. And I'd say if you look at the statistics, all walks of life are impacted. Black, white, Native American, Alaskan, everybody is affected. There's no discriminators. When I go to some of those AFSP events, you can see the cross-section of America there that's impacted. Poor, rich, everybody. So pay attention to your mental illness, because you may think you're on top of the world, but you're just a stressful situation or a chemical imbalance away from falling into that dark hole. Another point, I mentioned it earlier, is be proactive. Try to keep after it before you fall into crisis. Have a conversation with your medical provider, your family practice doctor, and say, hey, I'd like you to screen me for mental health. Let's get smart together here about how we check up on our mental health. I'm going to talk about counseling. So I was more afraid of going to the counseling than I was taking the medication when I was in the depths of my depression. The last thing I wanted to do was expose those raw nerves about some of the things that were holding me back. And it was very scary. If my wife hadn't personally driven me there and sat with me and made sure I went, I would not have shown up for those sessions. And what I would tell you is it's the best thing I ever did. So if there's still stigma out there about seeking counseling, I would say, leave that baggage back home. If you feel like you need to talk to somebody, it's to get coping mechanisms to help deal with the things that bug you in life. Go do it. And there's a lot of good ones out there. As you mentioned, I'm not a doctor. I'd say the treatment for mental health is still a little bit tricky. For other medical conditions, blood pressure, diabetes, there's physical tests that can be taken to check whether you're getting better or worse. With mental illness, no, there's nothing. It's feedback from the patient, and it's very subjective. And so that's one of the challenges in being treated for mental illness is you just don't have that indicator. There's a lot of good research going on. There's evidence. I mentioned that there's a genetic, I didn't mention it, but there is a genetic predisposition to mental health in our family. I struggled. My nephew took his life. I have a cousin who took her life. All 4 of my children have been treated for some form of mental illness. And so in addition to the stressors I was under, there was a genetic predisposition to some mental illness. And so I would ask people to check their family history. Everybody jokes about crazy uncle or crazy aunt. Maybe there's somebody in your family portfolio that had some mental illness. And if so, that's not an indication that you will struggle or your family members will, but it's something to be mindful of. And then the last thing I'd say is take care of yourself. Be kind. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to others. Life is very short. You don't know, and this is a lesson I learned, you don't know what other people are living with. And so nobody knew what I was living with, but I got a lot of baggage and I'm dealing with it. Who knows what that person who's a little bit grumpy or angry at work is dealing with. Kindness can go a long way towards helping them through their day and making them more productive and better citizens.
Yep. I remember when I was coming up through the ranks as a military officer and as a civilian, thinking that the admirals and the senior executives, those people have it all together. And, once I made senior executive, I realized, that's not necessarily the case. We all have the same problems as everybody else.
Right.
And that's one of the reasons why I've also started talking about it, and I'll talk about it more in my podcast, but I've gone and spoken about addiction to drugs and alcohol to several different Navy commands after what I went through with my son. And at some point I'll have an interview on this podcast with my son, who's doing very well now. But speaking out, I felt that I should speak out about it and it would help other people, considering that I was a senior executive. I just think that my speaking out about it would help other people speak out about it.
Yeah. Let me share before we close some resources that people could check on other than this podcast. As I mentioned, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP.org, has an excellent website. They've got sections in their website. If you have a family member or yourself are struggling, you can go there to get resources on how to get help. If you've lost somebody to suicide, there's great resources on how do you put that next foot forward after such a tragedy. And so AFSP.org is a great resource. Another one is the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org. And they provide some great education and resources for people who are coping with mental illness in their family or work situation. They've got some great training courses. So both of those organizations are out there. They're available in your communities with local chapters, very compassionate and caring volunteers who can help get you to the right resource. So I would encourage folks to reach out and use those resources if necessary.
And just like you did, as you found that there wasn't a local chapter for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, think about starting one in your own community.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I often wondered, why did I do so much volunteer work? I put a lot of hours in. I was working as an executive in a very busy job and took time to lead the organization to stand up this chapter. It was probably a 40-hour-a-week effort in its own right. But the rewards have been tremendous. I met so many great, compassionate, and caring people. I've got lifelong friends from that volunteer effort now. I know that if they ever called me and they needed something, I'd drop what I was doing and help, and vice versa, they would do the same for me. So we've got a connection because we volunteered on a cause that we were passionate about. And while your listeners may have causes that aren't suicide prevention, I would encourage folks to get out and volunteer. When I had 4 kids, I felt like with a working job and managing those kids, I didn't have time for volunteer work. And so when the kids got out of the house, I had some extra time. And this cause found me. This suicide prevention volunteer effort found me, and I'm very grateful. It was a great addition to my life.
So, Steve, if somebody listening wanted to reach out to you and contact you to learn more, how would they do that?
Yeah, Emily, I'd be comfortable with any of your listeners just sending me an email, Iselin, SRISELIN @gmail.com. And again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a mental health care professional, but I have a lived experience, and I'd be happy to steer people in a direction if they felt like I could be helpful.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing with us on this podcast how you moved onward from depression and how you're still successfully living with it today.
Happy to do it. Thank you, Emily, for having me on.
I can't thank Steve enough for helping us all improve our awareness of mental illness. Why is it that we can talk about getting a physical, going to the eye doctor, getting our teeth cleaned, or getting a cast on our broken arm, but we don't talk about mental illness or mental wellness? Steve shared these statistics with us. 1 in 5 will lose a family member to suicide, and 3 in 5 will know someone who died by suicide. 20 million people will struggle with depression in the United States every year. We can all be caregivers and help others who struggle with mental illness. Steve was fortunate to have a boss who understood he needed time to help heal from his depression, and he gave him that time. Instead of asking people, "How are you?" let's start asking, "What's your number?" And reach out to someone you know who is struggling. Be there for them. Listen without judging. By sharing his story, Steve helps others. Some he knows he helped, and I'm sure there are many he has touched without even knowing. He led the DC chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in raising over $750,000 in 3 years to support research and community suicide prevention programs. They also provided resources to help those affected by suicide move forward after losing a loved one. Please share this episode. I'm sure you know someone who needs to hear Steve's story and to hear him say that his life is better today after having survived his serious depression. Thank you for listening. I'm so excited to bring this show to you each week. Follow me at Onward Podcast on Instagram for daily tips and encouragement. And please give me feedback. How can the show help you move onward? What topics do you want me to cover on this show? Please subscribe to Onward and share the show with anyone who needs encouragement in overcoming adversity. We all know someone who would benefit from hearing these inspirational stories. Thank you to Dan Johnson for the music on this podcast. You can follow Dan at www.soulpajamas.com. That's SOUL pajamas.com. I look forward to spending time with you again soon.